For the next 30 years, Averroes wrote an endless stream of commentaries and interpretations on Aristotle's work. Wisely, he never came up with an answer to the Caliph's original question. The Caliph himself had already pronounced on this matter, but Averroes did advance several of his own answers to Aristotle, even providing arguments from Aristotle to support his point of view, which often contradicted Aristotle's. This was just the kind of approach that appealed to medieval Christian scholars, who quickly perceived its uses in the persecution of heretics. Translations of Averroes's commentaries on Aristotle began circulating in Paris, the great centre of learning at the time, but the Averroists, as they became known, soon found themselves in trouble. Aristotle may have been accepted by the Church, but these new teachings of his looked suspiciously unorthodox. In the conflict between reason and faith, there could be no doubting the supremacy of faith. The Averroists found themselves facing the prospect of a heresy charge, and the only way they could defend themselves was to use arguments from the same source as their heresy, namely the writings of Averroes. Fortunately, the situation was remedied by Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of the medieval scholars, who managed to patch up a compromise. Reason must indeed be free to operate according to its own inexorable laws, suggested Aquinas, but only from within the confines of faith. Reason without faith was nothing. Aquinas was deeply attracted to Aristotle and quickly recognized his supreme worth. He devoted much of his life to reconciling Aristotle's philosophy with that of the Church. In the end, he succeeded in establishing Aristotelianism as the philosophical basis for Christian theology. This was to be the making and eventual breaking of Aristotelianism. The Catholic Church pronounced that the teachings of Aristotle, as interpreted by Aquinas, were the truth, and could be denied only on pain of heresy, a situation which remains in force to this day. Much of Aristotle's philosophy concerned the natural world and was thus scientific. Science, like philosophy, makes pronouncements that appear to be the truth, but later turn out to be wrong. They must be modified as our understanding of the world increases. By declaring the works of Aristotle to be the Holy Writ, the Church painted itself into a corner, and the corner of a flat earth at that. Conflict between the Church and scientific discovery was thus inevitable. Aristotle is not responsible for this conflict between reason and faith, which was not satisfactorily resolved in Western thought until this century. Indeed, like Count Dracula, it still makes the odd, sensational resurrection when night returns to the world of learning. The argument raging in some of the United States between Darwinism, evolution, and creationism, the literal truth of the Bible, is but a recent example. Despite the demise of Aristotelian thought, Aristotle himself has continued to play a part in modern philosophy. The contemporary American philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, a profound admirer of Aristotle, found himself puzzled that such a supreme genius could also be guilty of making a number of simple errors. For instance, despite some earlier philosophers realizing that the Earth orbited the Sun, Aristotle remained convinced that the Earth was the center of the universe, an error which severely restricted astronomical knowledge for more than 1,500 years. Scientific thought was likewise hindered by Aristotle's belief that the world was made up of 4 primary elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Kuhn's study of Aristotle's errors led him to formulate his notion of paradigms, which revolutionized our thinking about the philosophy of science and had applications far beyond this field. According to Kuhn, Aristotle was led into error because of the way he and his contemporaries viewed the world, the paradigm of their thought. The ancient Greeks saw the world as consisting essentially of qualities, shape, purpose, and so forth. Viewing the world in this way, they were bound to arrive at a number of wrong-headed conclusions, such as those which marred even Aristotle's thought. The inevitable conclusion to be drawn from Kuhn's notion of paradigms is that there can be no such thing as a true way of viewing the world, either scientifically or philosophically. The conclusions we reach simply depend upon the paradigms we adopt, the way we decide to think about the world. In other words, there is no such thing as ultimate truth. From Aristotle's writings. We make war so that we can live in peace. Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, 1177b, 5-6. The object of life. All our arts and inquiries, just the same as all our actions and choices, are thought of as trying to achieve some good. For this reason we can correctly define the good as that which all things aim at. Yet obviously there is a difference between the ends at which things aim. Some of these ends are activities, whereas some are results distinct from activities. Where the ends are distinct from the actions, the results are naturally superior to the activities. Because there are all kinds of arts, activities, and sciences, it is inevitable that they have all kinds of different ends as well. The end of medical science is health. The end of military science is victory. The end of economic science is wealth. Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, 1094a, 1. Human good turns out to be the active exercise of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there is more than one excellence or virtue, in conformity with the best and most complete. But this activity must take place throughout a complete lifetime, for one swallow does not make a summer, any more than one fine day. Likewise, one day, or a brief flight of happiness, does not make a man completely blessed or happy. Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, 1098a, 16-19. Tragedy is the representation of an action that is worthy of serious attention, involves greatness, and takes place over an extended time, yet is complete within itself, portraying incidents which arouse pity and fear, so that such emotions are purged by the performance. Poetics, 1449b, 24-28. He who studies how things originated and came into being, whether this is the state or anything else, will achieve the clearest view of them. Politics, 1252a, 24-25. Thus it is clear that the state is a creation of nature, and it is one of man's characteristics that he alone possesses a sense of good and evil, justice and injustice, and such, and the coming together of living beings who possess this sense makes a family and a state. Politics, 1253a, 2-18. The notion of the state is naturally prior to that of the family or the individual, for the whole must necessarily be prior to the parts. If you remove the whole man, you can't say a foot or a hand remains unless you look upon this as if it were made of stone, for it would only be dead. A thing is only understood to be what it is owing to its abilities and its power to perform them. And when it no longer has these abilities or power, it no longer remains the same thing, it merely has the same name. It is thus obvious that a city precedes an individual. For if an individual isn't sufficient in himself to form a perfect government, he is simply to a city what other parts are to a whole, and anyone who is unable to live in society, or doesn't need to because he is sufficient unto himself, must be either a beast or a god. Thus everyone has a natural impulse to associate with others in this way, and whoever founded the first civil society brought about the greatest good to humanity. In this way man is the finest of all living creatures, just as without laws and justice he would be the worst. For nothing is so difficult to eradicate as injustice perpetrated by force. But man is born with this force, which is both prudence and valour, and it can be used for both just and unjust purposes. Those who abuse this force will be the most iniquitous, lustful, and gluttonous beings imaginable. On the other hand, justice is what binds men to the state, for the administration of justice, which consists of determining what is just, is the principle of order in political society. Politics, 1253a, 25-40. Democrats maintain that democracy is what the majority decide. Those who favour oligarchies believe that those with the most wealth should decide. But both these ways are unjust. If we follow what is proposed by the few, we soon have a tyranny. For if one person possesses more than any others, according to oligarchical justice, this man alone has the right to supreme power. On the other hand, if superiority of numbers is the criteria that prevails, injustice will be perpetrated by the confiscation of the property of the rich, who will be in the minority and thus have no say. The notion of equality to which both parties will subscribe must therefore be for the next 30 years. Averroes wrote an endless stream of commentaries and interpretations on Aristotle's work. Wisely, he never came up with an answer to the Caliph's original question. The Caliph himself had already pronounced on this matter, but Averroes did advance in the persecution of heretics. Translations of Averroes's commentaries on Aristotle began circulating in Paris, the great centre of learning at the time, but the Averroists, as they became known, soon found themselves in trouble. Aristotle may have been accepted by themselves was to use arguments from the same source as their heresy, namely the writings of Averroes. Fortunately, the situation was remedied by Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of the medieval scholars, who managed to patch up a compromise. Reason must announce several of his own answers to Aristotle, even providing arguments from Aristotle to support his point of view, which often contradicted Aristotle's. This was just the kind of approach that appealed to medieval Christian scholars, who quickly perceived its uses in the Church, but these new teachings of his looked suspiciously unorthodox. In the conflict between reason and faith, there could be no doubting the supremacy of faith. The Averroists found themselves facing the prospect of a heresy charge, and the only way they could defend